Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Of Kings and Killers, Chapter 23, 24, and Epilogue. Due to popular demand, I did not read the bloopers and will be reading those on the air. In this episode, I am going to talk about the way this ended. This was so much. There is so much going on. Oh boy, I don't even know where I'm going to start. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Asher for commissioning this episode. Asher is here in the chat and has left some questions for me about favorite things in the series so far and favorite moments and whatnot that I will talk about after I have done my little recap. But yeah, I have got to say, I had said at the end of the last episode how one of the issues that I had with the way Shara's book ended was that it felt kind of abrupt. And I was wondering if I was going to feel the same way about Calder's book, or if we, getting some more information would make it feel more rounded out, sort of the kind of thing that I was wondering was, is it going to feel abrupt for whichever book you read first? But then you read the second one, and because you're getting another POV and other information, maybe inevitably the second book is going to feel less abrupt than the first one did. But I think this is probably, for me, the main misstep of this series is the way he chose to end these books. I think there's too much happening, and it ends too abruptly for both of them. And that's not to say that there aren't satisfying moments in these chapters, because there definitely are. But it just is so sudden how we come to an end and we don't get answers on certain things. And I think that somebody, when I first started covering the series, mentioned that Will White has expressed some interest in coming back and writing more set in this universe. So it might be that it feels this way on purpose because he intends to revisit it and wrap up some other things or give us more information. But approaching it as the very final books in two trilogies, it doesn't feel wrapped up to me. So much happens right up until the last moments that I don't get a sense of closure that I was kind of looking for. I wanted to feel like I could see a hazy future on the horizon. And with both of these, I feel like I am left a little bit wrong-footed and not even entirely sure what happened in certain cases. It's genuinely so overwhelming. I read this section twice, and I still feel like I don't get how we managed to get out of whatever happened. I don't even understand who gets taken down and if there are great elders remaining still, because I am assuming there are, and the only two that got taken out were Urgnaut and Kellerak, and that we are still going to have to deal with Nkothi and Akhmagut. And I may be mistaken. See, this is what I mean. It's such a blur. There is so much back to back to back to back. So this is just going to be a bit disconnected feeling as I talk about what happened and my feelings on it. And I think that's going to reflect how it feels to me, to be perfectly honest, because it seems like I am not given enough time as a reader to like really process any of it. And my reread, I was hoping, would clarify some things. And to be honest, it feels almost more muddled after the second time through. So, yeah, Asher is saying I agree. They don't feel done. It makes me feel better to know it's not just me, you know? Because there are times where I'll read something and I'm just in the wrong frame of mind. And I'll reread it later and be like, I don't know why I had a problem with this. This is actually fine. But I read these like a week and a half apart because of, you know, like, I just, yeah, I'm feeling a bit let down. Georgie is asking, what do you think is the best reading order now that you've read them all? I kind of like the reading order that I did. Shara, Calder, Shara, Calder, Shara, Calder. I think you could do Calder, Shara, and I don't think that would be a bad way to do it. But, I almost could see it being more interesting to do it that way, because Calder, for me, feels like more of a player than Shara does in some ways. And I know that that's not really fair, but because of the position he winds up holding and everything, I feel like you could see Shara as sort of filling in a lot of gaps, whereas Calder feels like the real story. And I feel like maybe that's not totally fair, but it's just sort of how I feel about it, you know? And I like Shara as a character, but being in her head is a little bit, it feels a little flat sometimes. So I feel like seeing her as filling in gaps is going to sustain her a bit in my head, like putting her in that position. But I just really personally, like, I liked the way that I read them for my first time. And I don't think there's any problem with doing it this way, you know? Evil says it doesn't matter as long as Calder's book is last. Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. We know this series takes place years before Cradle and there's elders left. I doubt Osriel wants only one group of executors. Asher says, I read Calder first for the first two books, then swapped at the last because I liked Shara better. It was still an okay order. Yeah, I don't think that I don't feel like there's a definitive better order. I think it could work either way. I really could see it. But I don't think that Calder's book necessarily has to be last. It would be, but I don't know. I'm willing to take it. There's some things that I'll have a really definite opinion on. This isn't really one of them. I feel like you could go in a lot of directions with this. I would really like to hear from somebody who read all three of one book and then all three of another, because going back and forth between the POVs makes sense. And I do think that's a better way to do it. But if you are approaching these in a way where you're not like fully aware of the way it's going to work, I would just be very curious about what it's like to read all of one and then all of another. So anyway, okay. So we start with chapter 23. Under the broken sky, the sea boiled. And basically, shit is popping off here. Elders rose like towers. One appeared to be nothing more than a circular mouth, big enough to swallow the testament, filled with teeth on all sides. There were human ships among the enemy as well. Not any he recognized for the Navigators Guild, unfortunately. They looked like regular ships, but there were a dozen of them, each bristling with men. And there are some people fighting for the Great Elder here, and he has a moment of like, really? And then he sort of has to remind himself, I guess they fucking Sleepless have a lot of members, and people right up until the end are either going to still believe that we can find salvation through the elders, or they have to fulfill a bargain that they made. And we've got Cheska's ship. We've got Joran and Loralee each on a different ship. And Esther is overhead. And it says her face was hidden behind a full face helmet with a darkened glass visor. But that wasn't the only weapon she'd unearthed for this fight. 7 rough spikes of iron, big enough to impale apartment buildings, flew in her wake, casting shadows on the ships below. And knowing that she just yanked them up, that's wild. Like, really, I think my brain simply is not able to handle imagining the extent of the destruction that happens in the ends of these books. The city and a huge section of the ocean just fucking vanishes. It gets scooped away, disappears. I can't imagine. I can picture an earthquake-like reaction where things get brought down, where there's destruction of existing matter. But for a giant section of a city to just disappear and leave a nothing where it was, I can't wrap my head around that. And then her yanking these spikes up like through the ground of the city, like, no, this is too much. This is like somebody just pulling all of the sewers up through the ground of New York City, you know? And Bliss is over here, and she has been curled up, and she's up in the rigging, and she is not really participating in anything. He mentions later, noticing she has a new bag that he has never seen her have before. And I was like, interesting. So he's looking around like, all right, this is what we've got to work with. And let's see. As Calder firmed his resolve, his forearm began to burn. He yelped, grabbing his right arm with his left, but he seized only the Emperor's armor. His skin blazed without relief. He wished he could have gone without the armor. He had been forced to hide it as best he could from the Regents, but now that he was wearing it in the open, they would surely take it from him after the battle. And I thought that was an interesting assumption. I am not sure, why he is so certain they are going to do this. I know they are not, and they are not on his side. And I know that it may be seen as just sort of disrespectful for him to be wearing it, considering that he is not the Emperor. But still, I mean, this isn't theirs either. I don't know the sense of just having a right to it because the Emperor had sort of been one of them, I guess. But it just doesn't... there's just like a pettiness to that, you know? I don't know. It just kind of made me salty to even think in that direction. So here comes Kellerak with his shark-like face, and he does the whole, you will be broken. And in the end, when you beg to offer yourselves to me, you will know that I am Kellerak. There is something about the wording of, you will know that I am, and then the being using their name, that I know is like corny, but I still feel works and is pretty like intimidating in that moment. This works in Dresden Files as well when she says, I know that I am Mab. And I'm always just like, all right, I hear you. It just works. I don't know. Makes an impression. So the Leviathan has slowed down. And later on, we find out that this shit is just Loki waiting for Calder to die. It's not really planning on upholding its end of things unless he zeroes in and makes it, because it thinks it's a losing battle. And I'm not even like mad at it for that. That feels pretty reasonable, actually. So we have this moment here where he is thinking about how either way, even if he dies, they're going to beat Kellerak. He's like, look, either we defeat him or I give myself up and Shera kills me. I may die, but I know that one way or another this guy is going down. And there was something about how willing he seems to be that I admired a lot. There's not really a sense of like, I really hope I don't have to do that. It's just, if plan A doesn't work, we will do plan B. And there's no feeling of reluctance in him. I just can't say that I would necessarily be this prepared to go through with it. That's all I'm saying. And we have a moment here. Briefly, he wondered if the unknown God would take a prayer from him. And I don't know why, kids, but the fucking name Unknown God really hits for me. I am loving this title. It's like, it's just so vague. It's gender neutral, and it's not even like, there's a sense to it of unknown is such a sort of neutral way to phrase it. Not like it's beyond our understanding or anything that sort of suggests, to word it in like a weird way, it being like too good for humans. There's just, we don't know. We're not sure. And it's this amorphous idea. And as somebody who's like got a sense of faith in a very nebulous way, without it really being directed to any particular being or concept, this just feels really nice and succinct for the way I think of God. The unknown God. It's just like a kind of force that's out there that maybe it's out here. Maybe, I think. I don't even know that. Like, unknown encompasses so much, you know? So the battle begins. This is when Bliss steps in and is like, do not let yourself die before I get back. And he's like, why would I do that? And she's like, I will be pissed if you do it. And he just jumps off the edge of the ship. Petal says, how did she? I don't know. Calder said, I never know. And this is when Andal steps up and is like, where are the consultants? Because we have like a plan. And I don't see them around to take you out if that is what our whole plan is, you know? So let's see, here it goes. They get assaulted here by Elder Spawn. And Calder thinks to himself how like another crew may have been intimidated by this, but his people have been through so much wackadoo nonsense that they are fully prepared to cope. And they do this like with aplomb, to be honest. That is not to say that they're winning, because there are so many of these things that whether or not they are mentally overwhelmed, they are going to be physically overwhelmed, and there's kind of no avoiding that. And Calder is thinking about how if he were a real champion, he would be able to handle this, and then realizes, I'm not doing all I can. So he puts his helmet on and he leaves the light that Andal is like beaming out as a sort of protective like circle. He had no need to defend himself. The Elder Spawn who tried to bite into the Emperor's armor tasted only broken teeth. And he cut every fish in front of him, but he knew there would be more behind. He ran around the circle, pushing himself faster and faster, moving his arm more and more and more until it looked like everyone else was standing still. And as he's doing this, Petal is calling to him, and he is ignoring her. And he keeps pushing. And it says, ropes shot out and seized the Elder Spawn while they were still in the air, grabbing them and tossing them back down into the ocean. He didn't even need to look to pinpoint the Elder Spawn. He felt them, his sword flashing orange and destroying fish creatures before he turned his head. He reached deeper, straining the protection of the mark until gibbering terror threatened to spill out from some primal part of his brain. And then he uses water, the droplets on their bodies, and like does a brief investment on those and explodes them all. And this is when Petal really is like, you have to fucking drink this. And she yells at him to take the helmet off, and he starts to argue, and she is not usually this pushy. And he realizes like, okay, maybe this is very urgent after all. And drinks it, asks you couldn't have waited 2 seconds? And she shakes her head and points to her nose, and his nose had been bleeding the whole time. Clearly, this is taking a lot more of a toll on him than it was feeling like it did in the moment. And also, like, his champion's body, and I say champion's asterisk, body, requires a lot of maintenance because he wasn't transformed the way they normally are. So it makes sense to me that, like, in the midst of all of this, pushing himself the way he is, it's going to require maintenance a little bit more close together than he's used to doing it. So there is a moment here where he's like, oh shit, it really feels like Kellerak is on the run. We've got the best of him. I can tell he's really pissed, and I think maybe we're winning. And all of a sudden, here comes fucking Cathanachar, and he hears a voice, and it's Jerry. This bitch. Ugh. Jerry is really one hell of a character. I have got to give it to Will White how much she ruins everything all the time. And yet there is still a part of me that always wonders if maybe it's really too late for her, or if we can still convince her to turn her back on this bullshit. I want to give her a second chance in a way that I think so many writers try to make me feel about love interests that have fucked up. There are a lot of, like, you know, stories out there with, like, on again, off again romances and relationships where a person keeps being taken back, and I will be infuriated reading about it. Like, why are you believing this bullshit? And I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop and for our main character to inevitably be let down by them again, because they are clearly bad news. Jerry keeps making me feel like maybe, you know, and right up until this, like, last half of this book being in her head and really seeing she has no intention of backing down in any form. There is no moment in which she considers that she was wrong. Everything is about, then they'll see, then they'll all see. She is so certain she is correct and is willing to sacrifice absolutely everybody just to be right. And that is something that I simultaneously really understand, and also it is inadequate for what she is doing to people and to the world. Asher in the chat, Bill Compton, fucking Bill Compton. Amen. Oh my God. Guys, those of you who don't know, I am covering the Sookie Stackhouse books with co-host Miles, who I also did the Twilight series with, and that's a patrons only show for $5 and up patrons. Super fun if you're looking for another weekly show that I do with a co-host. And yeah, Bill Compton is the fuckboy, and I really enjoy how much Miles does not like him. And yet, the man is like part of the story in a way that you can't separate him out of it. Infuriating. And just gets chance after chance, even though he has screwed up to me in ways that are unforgivable. Oh, so annoying. So yeah, this with Jerry, it's just she is so intelligent so much of the time, and genuinely charismatic and, like, fun in ways that I regret deeply that they got their hooks in her the way they did, because she could have been great, and she just went in so totally the wrong direction, you know? So she shows up here, and I love when she says, sorry about meeting you like this, everybody. And Foster says, Nakothi, take your corpse. And Andal just says what he said. And Petal waves, because Petal has this weird sort of affinity for Jerry that is not earned, because it was completely manipulated, and it breaks my heart that Petal still feels something of loyalty towards her. I just hate that for her so much. So she asks to speak to Calder alone. They're reluctant to leave him, but they recognize that Calder can handle her, with the state he's in the armor he's in, everything. And this is when she says, if no one stops the outsider, he's going to destroy everything. The elders don't want to destroy us. They just want to escape. He is the real threat. So Kellerak has been lying about what would happen were the elders to escape. And that is unsurprising. I kind of appreciate, there's times where I am a major proponent of characters communicating with each other, attempting to convince each other, sharing the information they have. Maybe you could change someone's mind. But this is one of the few times where the fact that Calder does not attempt to explain doesn't bother me at all. He isn't going to try, and because what's the point? Like, after everything that's happened and everything she's been willing to sacrifice, if she is still believing what she's being told by Kellerak and willing to sacrifice Calder, literally asking him to give himself up to possession, there is no way that just common sense or reason is going to penetrate. It's not going to work. And she tries to tell Calder, he showed me what happened with Ergnaut. It's not really possession. It's more like a mixing of two people. If you're strong enough with your intent, you could possess Kellerak. And she's like, it's an equal deal. And Calder is like, I'd say I believe that when the sky falls, but that has happened. And I still don't believe it. And this is when he says, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but we're winning. And she says, no, you're not. And she has a worm summon a spyglass, and he looks out and he sees fucking Nkothi coming. Her body has risen. I'm not going to describe Nkothi's body. You can imagine it's as bad as it's always been with these descriptions. I hate it. But throughout this conversation, Calder is just sort of wondering what he should do here, because he could kill her, and he's like, as much as I feel like I kind of want to, it's not really going to change the nature of the conflict. She's one soulbound. I just don't see that working. So then he starts to be like, all right, maybe I do have to give myself up to Kellerak, because he can sense the fog and knows Shara is nearby. And she sees the resignation in his face and does this thing. She says, you've worked hard to get where you are. I was with you every step of the way, and I'll stay with you now. You can do this. And I was just like, God, she just thinks so much of this is about her and includes her. And I find this really fascinating, because we saw the moment where the elders sent her soulbound gem to her in that big ceremony. And, I have been working under the impression that they had a bigger destiny in mind for her based on something. But I'm wondering now, did they just find somebody who had the kind of recklessness that they were looking for combined with intelligence, and trick them into thinking that they were more important so that they would be willing to take certain risks? Is that all it was? Because it kind of feels now, looking back, like Jerry is motivated by a sense of self-importance in this conflict, and in her connection with the elders, that is really only borne out piece by piece in a way that feels very manipulated and handled. I feel like this was telling her that she was going to be very important to them, may have been simply to get her to be compliant. And it seems like actually kind of a genius way to handle somebody like this, But anyway, just considering how manipulative she is, thinking that maybe she was manipulated in a similar way is, in a in one sense really satisfying, and in another it feels like, oh boy, there was no chance for her, you know? So anyway, Calder is like low-key about to just hand himself over and die at Shera's blade. And all of a sudden, Shuffles lands on his shoulder and screams, "Gave up," because that was the last words she said were, "Even the Emperor gave up his life rather than losing a battle to the elders. You can do the same." So when Shuffles lands and says "gave up," Calder sort of stops short and realizes, like, wait, maybe I haven't tried everything. And he turns to her and says, "I don't plan to die here." And she says, "I'm sorry, you don't really have another choice," and begins to attack him with her soulbound, like, I want to say soulbound weapon, but that's like specifically the thing in her forehead. She's using like green fire from her hands, but I think that still counts as her soulbound weapon, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, she is unaware about the transformation he went through to stay alive. So this attack initially is really on his armor specifically, because she thinks if she gets through that, she will be able to get Calder. And she's very unprepared for the attack that Calder unleashes on her. And this was a rough scene, because when we're watching this from Shera's POV, she is expecting that Calder isn't going to be able to do it. He fights Jerry, but when it comes to the moment where he has to deal a killing blow, Shera is like, he's not going to be able to do it. And I was wondering what would be happening in his head when we are there, because he does do it, and there's a very little sense of hesitation. And he keeps on, as he is attacking her, imagining some like beautiful moments that they had together. And it says, to deceive a reader, she would have had to control her own intent so as not to leave behind any memories he could access. She had dedicated her life to deceiving him. Every one of those memories was a lie, an elder-spawned creature mimicking his wife. And I don't know why it never occurred to me before, but her being undercover for years, while intimately involved with a reader, is an insane amount of skill. It never even crossed my mind how easy it would be for him to crack that shell and find everything out. I don't know why I never thought of it before, but I just straight did not think of it. So when he mentions this here, and I realized the sheer level of energy that it would take for her to keep this up, even mentally, my mind was kind of blown. I'm going to be honest. Like, I don't know how many of you all have ever like done a sustained lie with somebody who's really close to you. But as somebody who like essentially cheated on her ex-husband, I can say I have. And the energy that it takes is extraordinary. Especially if you genuinely do still care about the person that you're lying to. And a part of you weirdly wants to tell. That conflict, just externally, and keeping up this facade is exhausting. And is part of why so many people confess, just to get it off their own chest, because it weighs you down. Imagining having to keep my mind in check the same way at all times, I genuinely can't imagine. I mean, that's just a level of deception that is so beyond what I can even comprehend, that I wish I had thought of it earlier and really appreciated the levels to which she was willing to be a false person to him, you know, like this just, I don't know, this was a real moment for me of like, oh shit, right. And At this point, she had come here to kill him, worse than kill him, to sell him to the elders. He let that truth run through him as he clenched his heart and stomped her through the railing. And it says he realized idly this was the exact spot where Shara had pushed her overboard. That seemed so long ago. If only he had never chased after her. And then he starts to cry. And I was like, yeah, you earned that, buddy. You get to cry. Like, you could cry for years and I would not be mad at you for that. This is wild. And it's not until Foster says she's not crawling back this time. She's gone down to... And Calder is like, oh, fuck. And all of a sudden, he hears Kellerak laughing, and her body has been taken over, and she raises into the air. And this is a moment where I have to give props to Travis Baldree, because Kellerak has taken over her body, and her voice is described as a weird mixture of Kellerak's and Jerry's. And Travis manages to do a mix of these two voices somehow. And you hear it. It's wild. I don't know what this man has, like, what dark force he has made a deal with, but Travis Baldree is too much. It's just not right. So, anyway, he begins to attack Kellerak. Foster is over here using his awakened gun that he doesn't even like to talk about. Petal is attacking with like this weird liquid that sort of expands when it's out of the body and locks her in place. And Andal stepped forward, white light projecting from his outstretched hand. It bathed the Great Elder, but Calder couldn't tell if it was doing any good. And Calder sends down to the Liatheton, get rid of him. And it slams a fist onto her body. Half a second later, the Elder's huge blue hand exploded into emerald flame. The Liatheton screamed, stumbling back. One of its shackles slid off its charred stump. And I was honestly kind of sad for this thing. It's like an evil, weird entity. And, part really of the Elder problem. But it was trying its best. This sucked. So he then uses the sword that he knows shouldn't work. He is so mad when it doesn't, though. It's like, but you knew better. Come on. And then, I love this moment. Andal marches in. I never liked you, Andal said. Either of you, he clarified. He focused his light on Kellerak. The Great Elder's power wavered, his body dipping in the air. Calder took the opportunity. And Kellerak's in the middle of saying, and all of a sudden he gets cut off by a gunshot. Again, Foster yelling, get away from my captain. Bless him. I love him so much, you guys. And let's see. It's harder than you think capturing a prize without breaking it, Kellerak mused. It has to be preserved so that you can break it slowly, one piece at a time, for years. And I will say this. I am disgusted with Jerry for coming in here and basically telling Calder to give himself up. But my one solace here is thinking that maybe a part of her is still in there. And that she sees now how wrong she was about the way Calder could have handled Kellerak within his own body. Like, she was fed this story about how they could be equal partners. And I am genuinely curious if there is any comprehension dawning on her in the midst of this, that it was all bullshit. Because I think she was under the impression, as I was for a while, that Kellerak cannot explicitly lie. And turns out, girl, we both had a little bit too much faith in that concept. So this is when Shara plunges the knife into his back. And I love the moment when she's just like, "Why did you have to warn him?" I had forgotten that she says that. Their little back and forth about accounts being settled and apologizing for some things. And then all of a sudden, after everyone starts to like celebrate this win, they realize that there is silence. And they're looking up, and the battle overhead that had been happening, there's no sound coming from that anymore. And Shara says, Urgnot won. And Calder says, no, he lost. And now it's over anyway. So this was a weird moment to me because I didn't really understand what he meant. I guess what he's saying is like, Urgnot is gone and he was defeated, but we still have a couple elders left. And they are going to be our undoing in the end anyway. Right? I think. So we have then Nkothi and her like song, "Rise, my children, come to me, rise once more and taste perfection." And all of a sudden, all these pieces of bodies begin to sort of draw together and get stitched into new weird configurations. Shara waved to the pieces and orbs of green light drifted up to hang in midair over them. The same thing that had happened when she'd killed Urziah, which I had forgot. And when he says thank you, she says, "Don't thank me yet." And I had forgotten that she pulls a bunch of Kellerak's power into herself when she attacks him. So this is, she's powered up and about to explode because she's got too much going on. Let's see. Candle Bay was close. They reached it in minutes. The elder practically flung them into the docks, then tore the shackles from its wrists. It did not wait around or waste a second. It was free. It swam out to sea without delay, and Calder found himself reaching through the mark of Kellerak, feeling it leave. He had hoped to sense something like fondness or regret, but all he felt was the elder equivalent of joy, satisfaction, fading rage, and a resolve to follow its own instincts. And I don't know, there was a part of me that was kind of like cracking up at the fact that Calder was like, I just wanted it to miss me a little bit. You're trying to put your affection into the wrong one, kiddo. And let's see. I'm trying to find. So, the people inside, I'm trying to get to jump ahead here because it looks like I only have 15 minutes left, which I can't believe. Do you think there's a world out there where everything worked out perfectly? Calder asked, where we just kept sailing, all 7 of us? 7? Andal said. 7! Shuffles shouted into Calder's ear. Andal nodded and returned his gaze to the testament. My mistake. I do really like that moment. Calder says, guards, take these 2 into custody. Petal gasped, but Andal showed as little reaction on his face as ever. He held out a hand. It's been an honor sailing with you, Captain. And so, yes, he is giving the 2 of them up. Sooner than he wanted, Calder stood once again in front of the Aiptasia. And long story short, he jumps in there, and there is so much of the Emperor left in the Aiptasia that he basically gets to visit with him in a similar way as like the echoes work in the labyrinth in Cradle. And I love this moment so much where the Emperor is basically like, you really thought you could do a better job than me, huh? And Calder is like, look, I was naive and I was young, but you are really arrogant. And he's like, oh, really? And you? And when Calder like feels his intent as if it's from the outside, he's like, oh, wow, I am too. He had always considered himself motivated by a desire to make the empire better, but that wasn't really it, was it? And Calder is like, oh my God, I'm a lot more like you than I thought. This sucks. And quotes Sedesthenes. The wisest king is the humblest servant of his people. The emperor gave a small, fond smile. It's been a long time since I used that name. This is a nice reveal. It takes a second for Calder to like comprehend what he means, and then is like, what? Sedesthenes was like one of your biggest critics. I have long been aware of my weaknesses. Alas, awareness of one's flaws is not the same as overcoming them. Yo, that's a fucking sermon right there. I would amend it to awareness of one's flaws is not the equivalent of attempting to overcome them. There are so many people out there that seem to think that just acknowledging that they are not great at certain things is enough. And that just saying, oh, well, you know, I can be an asshole sometimes. That's just where it stops. And they don't seem to believe that there's any need to improve in that area of their lives. And it's not, that's the self-awareness isn't the end of the story. That's where you start with the next phase of the story, which is self-improvement. But yeah, this moment. Then let's overcome them together, Calder said. Kellerak was gone, but Nkothi was still out there, perhaps the others as well. Osriel was poised to destroy the entire world. If Calder was willing to give his life, how could he refuse to work with the Emperor? And they wake up in the same body and go down into the Optasia. And this is the first time that Calder is like, I feel like a fucking emperor right now. I feel like I am the guy making the big choices and willing to put myself on the line. So then we get the elders are awake. They have not returned to full strength, but they scramble at the opportunity to leave the world. Cathanakar is decay. Othagar is worse. He is endless, disgusting biology, a cycle of breeding and consumption and mutation that sickens him. Nkothi is the third point of a triangle, blurring the lines between life and death. The Emperor's remaining intent is no more suited to this than Calder's. He had given his life rather than use the Optasia again, and his echo is certainly no match for the Great Elders, but he and Calder are together. They see Osriel. His scythe crackles against a blue membrane, and the shield that protects existence is ready to break at any second. There is great significance to that action, but they can't recognize it. The cracks in the sky aren't cracks. They're rifts held open by the power of the Great Elders. Calder follows threads of power down to the 3 awakened Great Elders. No, the 2. Nkothi's thread is a shadow of its former self, fading from existence. It remains at all, because she always exists in that incomprehensible state between life and death. So he focuses on the other 2. These threads must break. His awareness spreads to the statues, hundreds of statues across the world. He knows only when the statues explode, overloaded beyond their original purpose. The threads snap, the rifts fade, the sky returns. And the next thing we know, he is in a coma, and apparently has been for a long time. So he is able to close the rifts. The elders are still alive. And I am not entirely sure how the breaking of the threads even closed the rifts. Like how it seems like he essentially sent them back to sleep the way they had been. But I am not entirely convinced of that either. Like, this is just so vague, is what I'm saying, you know? It's just an overall, like, it feels a very temporary measure. And that is why I'm assuming it would have to do with these guys again if Will White picks up the series in the same universe. There's still plenty to be done. But I don't feel like I really understand what he accomplished here exactly and how this worked. And the way that the statues were used to do it, it's like, I accept that it worked, but it's so esoteric that I feel like if I look at it straight on, it sort of disappears. I have to sort of turn my face away and see it out of the corner of my eye. Does that make sense? So the epilogue, I had forgotten to mention that like Foster gets pulled off the deck of the ship and they're assuming that he's dead, and it turns out he's not. I was not worried about him. I'll be honest. The way that he gets pulled off the deck of the ship, I assumed they were going to find out that he was fine later. So the fact that he shows up in the epilogue, I wasn't really surprised. And we find out that like the Kellerax War or Battle of Candle Bay are the two names that seem to be sticking the most to everything that had happened. After the sky had returned, the three regions had officially declared the end of the Aurelian Empire. Their new government, the optimistically named Aurelian Alliance, was pushing its way through a host of new problems. There must have been some sort of plan, but to him, the Alliance seemed doomed to fail. And then we get interrupted, this is all Andel's like thoughts, by a child asking Foster, why didn't Kellerak kill you? And none of them know why, which makes me very suspicious. There's a part of me that was almost like, Kellerak isn't in Foster, right? Like, he didn't survive because we know Foster has made a deal with Kellerak before. I feel like that was mentioned at some point, right? And Kellerak needs a kind of bond with people in order to possess them. And I am deeply concerned that it's going to turn out Kellerak's actually in Foster after all. And I don't think so, because Kellerak had been in Shara, and Maya had like helped keep that from turning into what it could have. But I don't really know what the rules are surrounding jumping from one body to another. So let's see. Some researchers studying the last battle of the Empire claim that Kellerak didn't obliterate the entire fleet because of the suppressive effect of Bastion's veil, combined with Andel's own beacon. Those powers, combined with the energy it must have taken to animate the statues and battle the regents, had left him weakened to an almost human level. We also find out that like Foster was saved by his awakened tools, which is like the kind of power that nobody really wants to think about awakened objects having, soulbound objects. And Andel is wondering if maybe Jerry had been holding back a little bit, but he is really not convinced of that. So we have a moment with him and Petal getting on a new ship that they have called the Woodsman, which honestly did get me a little verklempt. I was like, oh. And then we go to Shuffles. We're inside its POV, and it's in the room with Bliss and some like guard or physician, and Calder, who has been passed out in a coma for quite some time. And she is insisting that there is still a possibility that he wakes up. This guy is trying to temper her optimism with like, yeah, that's unlikely though. And they finally both leave, and Shuffles goes up to Calder. It hopped down from its cage, fluttering over to where its pet human lay, unresponsive on the bed. Its eyes staring, unseeing, occasionally blinking. Which I thought was interesting, that he's blinking, like he's got some involuntary movement happening. Heart still beating, things like that, I'm assuming. But he isn't there. Shuffles had waited too long. Now it had the right word to bring the human back. It held the word, savoring it, until it had built up enough power. Then Shuffles bellowed, "Awaken!" The human's fingers twitched. like awakening an object? Is that kind of the thing Shuffles is doing to Calder right now? Like, there's a feeling here to me of I'm curious about what this is going to mean. Do not know. All right. So, let's see. Georgie in the chat, I have to like kind of speed things up to get through the bloopers here. But Georgie in the chat says, the crack in the sky was made using the Optasia, and the elders jumped on the opportunity to escape and hold it open using those threads and energy. When Calder snaps the thread, it closes again, so everything reverted to normal. Them trapped on the planet, so there was no reason to do this big battle and showdown. The opportunity is over, so they go back to business as usual. Slow King plotting in the dark, status quo under the Emperor, so not solved, but managed for now. Yeah, I mean, I got that much, but I didn't really mechanically understand it, if that makes sense. Asher is saying it's very common for people in a persistent vegetative state to make reflexive movements. I knew that there were some movements. I didn't know that they would just straight up have their eyes open and blinking. I had heard about blinking like intermittently when their eyes were mostly closed. What I keep thinking about, honestly, is like, you have to keep your eyeballs moist or else they dry up. That is genuine danger. And there are people out there who like lose their eyelids and stuff. And I guess you just have to use potions and shit on him to make sure that he stays okay. So, okay. Bloopers. Let's do the bloopers. You ready, guys? In the stained glass room floating in the void, Osriel leaned back on his couch. I can tell you the 3 ways to be rid of the creatures you call Great Elders. You should listen well, Lyndon. Calder blinked. My name isn't Lyndon. It isn't? No. Osriel swallowed hard. Oh, no. I'm in the wrong world. Osriel, what are you doing, babe? That's pretty good. Calder spun back to help Andal just in time to see the frog-like elder swallow his quartermaster whole. Calder let out a breath of relief and sheathed his cutlass. Jerry hurried up and grabbed his arm. What are you doing? We have to rescue Andal before he dies. No, Andal's fine. He was swallowed whole. Nobody who gets swallowed whole ever dies. Now, if he'd fallen off a cliff into a never-ending abyss, then I might have been worried. This feels like a reference to something. What is that? Is that something? What is that, guys? What is that? I feel like I'm missing something here. Okay. Next one. Long ago, a tutor for the Alchemist Guild walked into a cell where a disturbing little girl was stacking up bones like blocks. The girl was pale, creepy. She didn't blink enough. The tutor immediately decided to skip the day's lesson. He could report to Boreas that everything had gone perfectly and no one would ever know that he'd shirked his duties. He glanced at his lesson plan. Why did anyone need an entire lesson on personal boundaries? The tutor tossed the lesson plan into the trash bin. 20 years later, Calder Martin threw open his bedroom wardrobe to find Bliss staring at him from inside. I do enjoy that. That's pretty good. Asher says it's a trope reference like Jonah and the whale. The swallowing, I know that is a trope reference. But the falling off a cliff into a never-ending abyss, that feels like a reference to something specific. And that I don't know what the trope is with that, because the only never-ending abyss thing I've ever encountered was in not Galaxy's Falls. Shit. You guys know the one I'm talking about. And it's they eventually come out the other side and it's totally fine. So Evil is saying Loki MCU. He falls into a never-ending abyss. God, I don't remember that. I liked that show too. I'm surprised I just don't remember a thing. All right, next one. Laura Lee says, He is not controlled, I am certain. I have thoroughly read him, his ship, his crew, and his possessions. I will vouch that he is not a puppet, only a fool, a moron, a chump, a sucker, an idiot, some might call him, relentlessly selfish, you could say, short-sighted, arrogant, childish even. There are those who might suggest his emotional growth was stunted in childhood, and I can't say I disagree. Esther released her psychic grip on Calder's throat, letting him spill to the floor, coughing. If you say so, Lorelei, I'll let him go. Calder waved a hand. No, never mind. Just strangle me. That's pretty good. I enjoy that. Last one. Calder stood and moved to the window. He reached out to see if he could touch the illusion that Kellerak was showing him. His hand tapped against the glass. Instantly, the vision changed. He saw inside a dark room where a man hunched in front of a brightly lit screen, his fingers working furiously. Everything from the clothes the man wore to the decorations in the room were strange to Calder. What is this? He asked. I can tell you what it isn't, Kellerak responded. Cradle. Fucking Will. Oh. God. All right, Will. I hear you. Look, I can't help it. We're gonna make the comparisons. We can't help it, Will. I get it. God. That's pretty funny, though. All right. I am going to wrap this one up, everybody. Thank you again, Asher, so much for commissioning this entire book. Really appreciate you. This entire pair of books, I should say. I'm just really glad that I was able to finish the series in decent enough time that I hadn't completely forgotten everything that happened in the second set of books by the time I got to these. And I'll be very interested if he comes out with more in this universe, because I feel like he has really gotten better as a writer since the first of these. And I know he was writing the last one in conjunction with Cradle, obviously, because the bloopers and everything. But, if he decides to pick this back up, I am wondering what kind of changes we'll see to the way he approaches certain things. And also, I just want to know what the fuck is going on with Calder. Calder has clearly leveled up in some way. We know that also Shara has. She's a regent now. And I still feel like I don't quite comprehend what happened with either of them. Shara being soulbound to two objects and having stabbed the heart of Nkothi with one. She stabs Kellerak with the other. She has gone up against some big baddies. So I just have to assume that it's the absorption of all of this power and whatnot. There's no avoiding a kind of transformation that will happen to her. But I kind of want more detail on that. I want an itemized, series of like in a video game where your sliders go up. I just want to see what sliders are where. I want to know how this works. So yeah, and he may write more in this universe and it won't have anything to do with Shara or Calder. They may not factor into any of it. I don't know. So I guess we'll see someday. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Asher. And I will see you guys around inevitably, I am sure, for another Will White series. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.